The night was unusually cold, and the wind howled across the empty highway. Jacob, a struggling mechanic from a small town, sat on the hood of his old, rusty pickup truck, staring at the open road. His fingers were numb from the chill, and his stomach ached from hunger. Business had been slow for months, and he barely had enough money to buy dinner. Yet, despite his struggles, he still believed that hard work and kindness would one day turn his life around. Just as he was about to leave, he noticed a faint glimmer of headlights in the distance. A black luxury sedan sat motionless on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. Jacob hesitated for a moment. It was late, and he was exhausted, but something about the scene tugged at his conscience. With a sigh, he grabbed his tool kit and walked toward the stranded car. Inside, a well-dressed man in his late 50s sat in the driver's seat, tapping his phone in frustration. He looked up as Jacob approached, his eyes filled with worry. "Car won't start," the man muttered. "Battery seems fine, but I have no signal to call for help." Jacob nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "Mind if I take a look?" The man hesitated for a second, then stepped out, watching as Jacob lifted the hood and inspected the engine. Within minutes, he found the problem, a loose fuel line. It was a simple fix, but it required a steady hand. Jacob worked carefully, tightening the connection and wiping the grease from his fingers. "Try it now," he said, stepping back. The man slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. He let out a relieved chuckle, stepping out and shaking Jacob's hand. "You just saved me a lot of trouble, young man. What do I owe you?" Jacob wiped his hands on his jeans and shook his head. "No charge. Just glad I could help." The man studied him for a long moment, as if trying to understand why someone struggling himself would offer kindness for free. Then, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you ever need anything, call me," he said before getting into his car and driving off. Jacob barely glanced at the card before tucking it into his pocket. He had helped people before, and they often made promises they didn't keep. He didn't think much of it as he got into his truck and drove home. The next morning, as he was sipping cheap coffee in his tiny, cluttered garage, he pulled out the business card and finally looked at the name. His hands froze. The card belonged to Richard Langston, the CEO of Langston Motors, a billionaire who owned one of the biggest automobile companies in the country. Jacob's heart pounded. Could this be real? Had he really helped that Richard Langston? With shaking fingers, he dialed the number on the card. To his surprise, Richard answered immediately. "I was hoping you'd call," he said with a smile in his voice. "Listen, Jacob, I've been thinking about what you did last night. You could have charged me a fortune, but you didn't. That says a lot about your character. I need someone like you in my company." Jacob nearly dropped the phone. "Wait, what?" "I want to offer you a position. You'll be working in our research and development department, testing and improving engines. Full salary, benefits, and relocation expenses covered if you're interested." Jacob was speechless. Just last night, he had been struggling to afford food, and now he was being offered a job that could change his life forever. His hands trembled as he gripped the phone. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Richard chuckled. "You've earned it." Tears welled in Jacob's eyes. He had spent years fixing cars in a rundown garage, barely making ends meet. He had dreamed of working with advanced automotive technology, of making a real impact, but life had never given him the chance. Now, because of one act of kindness, everything was about to change. He took a deep breath and finally found his voice. "Yes. I'd love to." That single word set his future in motion. Within weeks, Jacob left his small town and stepped into a world he had only dreamed of. He worked tirelessly, proving his skills and dedication every single day. Years later, he wasn't just a mechanic, he was a lead engineer, designing the very cars he had once struggled to fix. And every time he looked back at that night on the empty highway, he knew one thing for sure: kindness had changed his life forever.